the manufacturing, transportation, and processing industries, and some government operations use a wide range of chemicals. Some of these chemicals have the potential to harm workers who are not prepared to protect themselves. The range of hazardous chemicals is quite broad. Acids, solvents, caustics, products containing heavy metals like mercury, lead, or barium, plating solutions, cleaners and degreasers, or mixtures containing these chemicals are all hazardous chemicals. Other less obvious materials like detergents, compressed gases, fuels, and paints can also pose risks of injury. These hazardous chemicals may be present in bags, carboys, drums, boxes, bottles, pails, cylinders, reaction vessels, tote tanks, or bulk tanks, containing as little as a few ounces, up to thousands of gallons. Your employer does not want you to suffer harm or injury from exposure to any hazardous chemical, not during normal working conditions or even during foreseeable emergencies. That is why the training you are about to receive is so important. The Hazard Communication Rule, enacted years ago by both federal and state labor authorities, establishes that all American workers have a right to know about any chemical hazards present in their workplaces. The rule requires that all employers take certain steps to communicate these hazards to their employees and show them how to protect themselves. The rule requires that every employer write and implement a Hazard Communication Plan, or HAZCOM plan, spelling out how it will communicate critical safety information on chemical hazards to its employees. The plan for your facility contains a list of all the hazardous chemicals present to which you could possibly be exposed. This list includes not only purchased chemicals, but also any hazardous chemical intermediates or byproducts generated within your facility. The HAZCOM plan identifies all operations where hazardous chemicals are used, handled, packaged, reacted, or stored. It identifies where hazardous chemicals are present in unmarked pipes and any non-routine work tasks involving hazardous chemicals. The plan describes all the types of container labels and how to access detailed chemical safety information. The plan describes all engineering controls and work practices that are used to prevent exposure. It also describes any special equipment that has been installed and special work procedures implemented, such as special ventilation devices and the use of personal protective equipment. The plan also describes the methods and observations you can use to detect the presence or release of hazardous materials. It will describe any chemical monitoring done at your facility and how it operates. There are some exceptions to the HAZCOM rule. Hazardous wastes are not regulated under HAZCOM. They use special labels and are regulated by the EPA. Another exception is consumer products used in the workplace, like some paints and paint thinners. Consumer products are not required to follow the HAZCOM rule. The HAZCOM plan is available for you to examine. If you would like to read it, ask your supervisor or safety specialist. The United Nations has recently developed a new uniform worldwide system of hazard communication. It's called the Global Harmonization System, or GHS, and the U.S. has adopted this new standard. The GHS is replacing the old system in the U.S., and we are now going through a transition period. The purpose of the GHS has been summed up as moving from worker right to know to worker right to understand. For the next few years, the methods that we and other countries have always used to communicate chemical hazards will be changing. So for a while, there will be different formats for hazard communication in your workplace. The old and new have a lot in common. but they also have some important differences. Due to differences in hazard definitions and classes, some chemicals will fall into different categories. This training program will show you both the old and the new, and how to use each to protect yourself. Just about every portable container holding hazardous chemicals in your workplace must be labeled, tagged, or marked in some way to alert users to its hazard or hazards. Portable containers can have either of two types of labels: the labels placed by the supplier, manufacturer, importer, or distributor who sold and shipped the product, often called shipping labels, and the labels placed by your own facility, often called workplace labels. Many facilities routinely use chemicals that are still in their original shipping containers. Labels on shipping containers may be affixed, printed, or attached to the immediate container, or on an outer packaging. All labels contain information about the product inside, like net weight and lot number. But up to this time, shipping labels could vary widely in how much chemical hazard information they contained. Some labels had almost nothing. The GHS requires certain hazard information be present on all shipping labels. GHS labels all have 6 specific types of information on them: a product identifier, a signal word, 1 or more hazard statements, 1 or more pictograms, 1 or more precautionary statements, and the identity of the chemical supplier. Shipping labels have always had a unique product identifier. It may be a chemical name, trade name, or a product number, and that same identifier must be referenced in the HAZCOM plan. A signal word will usually appear prominently on each label. GHS labels only allow 2 signal words: danger or warning. Danger is used for materials in the severest hazard categories, and warning for the less severe categories. Under the old system, the signal word caution was also used. It was between danger and warning, but is not used under GHS. This simplifies the labels. Under the GHS, each label will carry 1 or more pictograms if a pictogram has been assigned to that chemical. The pictogram always appears inside of a red diamond. Here are the 9 pictograms that you could see under the GHS. Some are very similar to the Department of Transportation symbols that have been used for shipping hazardous materials in the U.S. for years. Oxidizers are symbolized by the circle on fire. The flame symbol is used to identify flammables, anything that can burn uncontrollably, or where heating or reacting can cause safety problems at temperatures that might be present in the workplace. Explosives and reactives are represented by the exploding bomb. Highly toxic chemicals by the skull and crossbones. Corrosives by the hand and metal figures. Gases under pressure by the gas cylinder. There are also some new symbols used in pictograms that you may not have seen before. The star in chest symbol indicates severe health hazards such as carcinogens, chemicals that can cause cancer, and some toxics. The exclamation mark indicates less severe health hazards, such as irritants and sensitizers. Unlike the star in chest and skull and crossbones, the health hazards of chemicals with the exclamation mark rarely cause death or permanent damage. The last new symbol is the dead fish, dead tree symbol, which indicates environmental hazards. Next, 1 or more hazard statements will appear on the label. There are 114 standardized hazard statements. Each one is a short phrase describing the nature of a specific hazard and its severity. Each label will carry 1 or more precautionary statements. there are 140 standardized precautionary statements. They are aimed directly at the handlers of the chemical. Precautionary statements can address up to 4 types of precautions. Prevention, that is, measures that will prevent accidents, exposure, or injury, like wearing a face shield when pouring a liquid. Response, measures that can be taken to respond to an injury or exposure, such as using an emergency shower to rinse chemicals off the skin. Storage, like only storing the chemical in an area that is kept below a certain temperature. And disposal, such as if the waste residue from this chemical is likely to be a hazardous waste. Identification of the supplier must also appear on the label. It will have the name, address, and telephone number. The Department of Transportation has its own labeling system for identifying hazards during shipment. This is the familiar diamond-shaped label. The DOT hazard label may appear on the hazard communication label on the outer shipping container, or it may appear separately. Anytime you encounter or work with or around a new chemical or one you do not recognize, you should read the label completely. Even if it's just another brand of a chemical you have used before, read it before you start working with it. It will give you a quick but essential summary of the most important hazard and safety information. Know and understand the label information before you start working with any chemical. If your facility repackages, mixes, blends, or transfers hazardous chemicals it receives into other containers, then workplace labels must be placed on the new portable containers. These containers are sometimes called workplace or secondary containers. The same is true if your facility handles hazardous chemicals in stationary containers, like bulk tanks and pipes. There are a number of options for workplace labeling. 2 styles of workplace labels in common use are the Hazardous Material Information System, HMIS style, and the National Fire Protection Association, NFPA style label. Adoption of the GHS has not changed workplace labeling requirements. In addition to spaces for the product identifier and other information, both styles of workplace labels show 3 categories of hazards. Health hazards, in blue, flammability, in red, and reactivity, in yellow or orange. Both styles use a 0 to 4 numbering system to indicate the severity of the hazard. The higher the number, the more severe the hazard. Materials with a 3 or 4 in the red area can catch fire at temperatures often found in normal workplace operations. A 3 or 4 in the blue, yellow, or orange area means that the chemical poses a high risk to your health, or it could detonate or react violently. A number 1 or 2 in any of the colored areas still indicates a hazard, but one that is less severe. 0 means virtually no hazard of that type. At the bottom of both styles of labels, there is a white area. The hazardous material information labels use this white area for personal protective equipment to be worn under normal working conditions. A code number or symbol may be used rather than listing specific PPE. The white area on the NFPA label is for specific hazards. There are letters and symbols for these hazards. The most important thing to remember about all types of labels is they only work if you use them. For example, don't be fooled into thinking a new material is harmless just because of its name. Like this stuff. Sounds harmless, right? Actually, it's a hazard category 3 flammable liquid. Don't assume anything about a new chemical. Read the label before you open any container of any chemical that is new or unfamiliar to you. Labels also don't work if they are not there or are not readable. Never use or handle any container that does not have a label, or if the label is not completely legible. Never remove or deface any shipping label or workplace label without specific instructions from your supervisor. Even then, label removal may only be done if the container is immediately relabeled or it is thoroughly emptied, cleaned out, and rinsed. This goes for DOT labels too. Do not remove them either without authorization. For years, Material Safety Data Sheets, MSDSs, have been the most comprehensive source for identifying chemical hazards and finding out about proper safety precautions. You have probably seen an MSDS book in at least one of your work areas, or know how to access this information electronically. Manufacturers, importers, and distributors must supply accurate, complete, and up-to-date MSDSs to each of their customers for any hazardous chemicals they supply. This applies to chemicals in portable containers as well as bulk chemicals. But the format and organization of each supplier's MSDS has been pretty much up to them. Under the GHS, these reference documents will now be called simply Safety Data Sheets, or SDSs. SDSs are arranged in a very specific order with specific headings for each of 16 sections. Every section must be listed in the SDS, in order, even if there is no available information on that topic. The first section will always be Identification. This section shows the unique product identifier. The product identifier on the SDS must exactly match the product identifier on the shipping label and in the HAZCOM plan. This is how you use the label to lead you to the correct SDS and also to that particular chemical in the HAZCOM plan. Under the GHS, this section also lists the recommended use of the product and any restrictions on its use. The second section is Hazards Identification. Under the GHS, much of the information that was listed in this section in MSDSs has been moved to other sections in SDSs. This section now contains the signal word, hazard statements, pictograms, and precautionary statements, as seen on the label. The SDS may also carry additional hazard information and precautionary statements that do not appear on the label. This section lists any of the 16 possible physical hazards. Physical hazards are those that cause harm by a physical effect from outside the body, such as an explosion, a fire, or a violent chemical reaction. Flammables, corrosives, and pressurized gases are the most common hazardous chemicals that pose a physical hazard. This section also identifies any of the 10 possible health hazards. Health hazards are those that cause harm from inside the body, like a poison or attacking a specific organ. The most common health hazards are acute toxics, corrosives, and chemicals that harm the skin, eyes, or lungs. Under the GHS, this section may also list other hazards, including simple asphyxiant, combustible dust, pyrophoric gas, or a hazard not included in any of the other categories. The pictograms that appear on the label correspond to these hazards. For example, the flame pictogram means the chemical can catch fire by any number of methods, such as from a spark or heat, or by self-reaction, or that it could emit a flammable gas. The star in chest pictogram could mean that if the chemical entered the body, it could damage certain organs or cause cancer. When reading this section of an SDS, you may see hazard categories listed. These categories can be numbers and/or letters. For example, an extremely flammable liquid is hazard category 1, while a liquid that is only combustible, that is, it must be heated to a much higher temperature in order to burn, is hazard category 4. Now there's a tricky part here. Be aware that the numbered hazard categories under the GHS are the opposite of the numbering system used by the HMIS and NFPA labels. Recall that HMIS and NFPA workplace labels use a 0 to 4 rating system, with 4 being extreme hazard and 0 being minimal hazard. Under the GHS, 4 is the least severe hazard category, and 1 is the most severe. You must pay really close attention to the source when you see one of these hazard ranking numbers. The third section of the SDS will have composition information on ingredients. For mixtures, all hazardous components present at 1% or greater will be listed here. All carcinogens will be listed if present at 1/10 of 1% or greater. Then comes first aid measures. This section contains the recommended first aid measures to provide to persons who have been exposed, such as what to do if someone gets it on their skin or in their eyes. New under GHS, this section now lists the most important symptoms that may result from exposure. Next is the firefighting measures section. Under the GHS format, this section also identifies any special protective equipment or precautions needed by firefighters. The sixth section has accidental release measures. This section is for persons responding to an uncontrolled release, an emergency response situation. This section has directions and the materials needed for safe containment and cleanup of the spill, often showing different procedures for small and large spills. Then, handling and storage. This section is unchanged under GHS and still describes the precautions and conditions needed for safely handling and storing the chemical. Exposure controls and personal protection lists occupational exposure limits, appropriate engineering controls, and PPE to be used for normal work activities involving the material. Note that this is usually different from the precautions associated with uncontrolled releases that were listed in the section on accidental release measures. The next section is the physical and chemical properties. The 10th section has stability and reactivity. This section continues to list the conditions to avoid, such as static discharges, shock, or mixing with substances that are incompatible and could cause an explosion or release of toxic gases. GHS SDSs now list the reactivity of the chemical also. Then, toxicological information. Under GHS, this section is where you will find the possible routes of exposure. The next section is ecological information, how spills of this chemical can damage the environment. Then, disposal considerations. SDSs will describe how to dispose of residues and contaminated chemicals properly and in accordance with applicable environmental regulations. Next is transportation information. Then, regulatory information. The 16th and last section contains other information, including the date the sheet was published. If you find an old SDS, the supplier should be contacted about updates. With all SDSs, you will see all this information in exactly this order. If you work with or around hazardous chemicals, you have to always be alert to the danger they pose. It is very real. With all the thousands of hazardous chemicals out there, it can seem almost impossible to know about all the hazards. But the Hazard Communication Standard is in place to guide you, and the new GHS hazard communication process makes it more effective than ever. Labels are placed on most containers that hold hazardous chemicals. Read the hazard label before you start working with it. Understand how to interpret the symbols, pictograms, signal words, and statements on these labels. Use this information every time you work with that chemical. Know the hazards and the precautions and make sure you follow the label instructions exactly. For more detailed chemical safety information, make sure you know how to access the SDSs for the specific chemicals you work with or around. Read the SDSs. Under the GHS changes, they are easier than ever to understand. The SDS has all the information available on safe use and handling of that chemical. The GHS HazCom plan, the labels, and the SDSs. These are your tools to really understand the hazards of the chemicals you work with and to keep yourself safe.